Thank you, Richard. It's been, yes, many years, and the European professions owes a lot to what you've done with the CPR and your impulse in all this macroeconomic thinking. So it's really for me a great pleasure to be with you tonight, and to present you a very short summary, snapshot of this latest book, which is in France called Le monde est clos et le désir infini. In English, it would be The world is closed and the desire is infinite. It's a title which I borrowed from a famous philosopher of the 60s named Alexander Cohen, which was about the scientific revolution, and the book's original title was From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe, which was a way of describing how we moved from Aristotle to the world of Galileo and Newton. And you will see that there is a connection, despite the beauty of the title itself, there is a connection with what I will have to say. So let me enter the topic with some time perspective, some historical perspective to begin with. When the economists are asked to summarize at 2 o'clock in the morning their view of world history, they basically boil it down to 2 events. One is the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, and the second one is the Industrial Revolution, something like 200 years ago. And in between, nothing, afterwards, nothing. It's a story of 2 events. Of course, we could get back to the hunter-gatherers, but it's a story of 2 events which for a long time, of course not exactly quite the same amount of time, frame the story of humanity and of human civilizations, and each had its own law. From an economic perspective. The agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution as it is called sometimes, has lived and expanded civilization within a paradox, which is that agriculture is about feeding people, and all the agrarian civilization ended up in famines, people starving. And of course, this paradox, which is the essence of these 10,000 years of agrarian civilization, has a name which is known in the economic profession and more generally speaking as Malthus's law. It's a law about self-defeating the essence of what you're trying to do. And in a nutshell, it's very simple to summarize. When you are better fed, you have more children, and more children lead to more children again, and to a demographic explosion, which in the end result to overpopulation. So the law of history over these almost 10,000 years of post-Neolithic revolution is the number of people rising, but at the same level of income per head, starving in greater numbers over the centuries. When Malthus explained this law, it was very rapidly endorsed by the economists of the time, the Ricardo and even Marx to some extent imported that, but the hard numbers over this law took some time before they really penetrated the economic and academic modern consensus. If you read a book like the book by Gregory Clark, a famous book among the economic historians called Farewell to Arms, you see a fascinating number of data showing that this Malthusian law was indeed right. If you look for 10,000 years at the size of skeletons, you see that they are not rising, which is an indication that people were not better fed over the years, over the millennium. If you look at the diet of hunter-gatherers, those that remained before they were exterminated in Venezuela or perhaps in the Aborigine in Australia, you see that the number of calories intake that they have access to is probably superior to the calories intakes of a worker of the early industry in England in the beginning of the 19th century. And Clark goes with thousands of examples, maybe not thousands, there's lots of examples pointing to the fact that after all, this very simple law, which is income per head, calories per head, are constant, and its population, which is rising with the advent of new technologies regarding agriculture, may be simply right. What I find fascinating about this law, and this is a manner of introduction to what I will say in a second, is that it's likely, although it's not certain, and certainly I could not decide whether it's true or not, that the population which were subject to this law failed to understand it. It's a law that imposed itself against the intelligence that the people may have of what was going on. I say that because if you look at the work of all the great ethnologists, anthropologists, Lévi-Strauss and so on of the world, they spend a lot of time explaining the rules which determines how you can marry this or that person and so on, but they never speak about demography. It's never part of the reason why you should marry at this age or so, such person or such other person. So either this is a reflection that they, as anthropologists, they completely fail to see the big picture, or it is a reflection of the fact that the societies themselves fail to understand demography as a driver of what they were heading to. And it's very open in the literature. But I think there is a good case to be made from the reading of all these anthropologists that demography, except in few cases, maybe in Tahiti, in which there was a tradition of strangling the children when they are born in order to keep having a sexual relationship free from the constraint of society, but of what we would call society here. Except in such few examples, it's not very obvious that there were rules pertaining to the law of demography themselves. Now, having said that, in the literature, in the profession, there are two schools of thoughts around these Malthusian laws. The school of Malthus, Ricardo, Malthus himself, and all the followers. But there's been another school which was generated in the 60s of our century, of the past century, by a Danish economist called Esther Bostrup, which is quite famous. And in this book, she demonstrated that Malthus was presumably wrong in one dimension, which was that when there was demographic pressure, bringing down the level of income, the number of calories per head down to the limit of starvation, you could see that there were innovations arising from this pressure, from this constraint, freeing new resources and allowing population growth to expand beyond the point that it had reached before in an endogenous process of technological innovation, allowing to overcome the demographic pressures, the demographic constraints. And in the schools, my daughter is learning to prepare some business school. I could read in her book that you had to choose Malthus or Bostrup, whether you were a pessimistic like Malthus or an optimistic like Bostrup, believing in the ability of technological progress to go beyond whatever state of nature you have reached. But of course, we know that the two can go together. In particular, there was a very important and famous article by a professor at Harvard called Michael Kremer, who demonstrated that the two could be true together. That is, people would starve on average after, after an initial burst of innovation, you would very rapidly be overcrowded by the demographic law. But still, once this happened, the number of people itself would predict the degree of innovation. And if the degree of innovation is proportionate to the degree of people, you would have a law, which is exactly what Kramer has estimated over a long time horizon and showing that it can work in different environments, a law by which the growth rate of population is proportionate to the size of the population. The growth rate is proportionate to the state of the variable population. Now, any one of you who knows some laws of physics knows that this is the law of motion of a nuclear reaction. When the growth rate of a process is proportionate to the state, the value of the state variable that drives this process, then it explodes in finite time. And Kramer himself doesn't emphasize that, but in his own equation, you can exactly derive the time at which this Malthusian Bostrup law of motion of population growing all the more rapidly than the population itself is large, there is a time when it explodes. So I played with my Excel things with the parameter of Kramer and find that the explosion was due to happen sometimes, it's very imprecise, in the middle of the 21st century. And I read in between a book, an extraordinary book, in which two guys who I never heard of, Johnson and Hill, published a book at Stanford University Press in 1987 called The Evolution of Human Society, completely unaware of Kramer and all that, demographer extrapolating the law of motion. And they reached the conclusion that the world was born to explode on November 13, 2026, which is pretty, frightening. So this Malthusian epoch, far from being a still, unmoving period of time, is in fact an exploding process which could have taken the size of population to become somehow mathematically impossible, infinite. Now, the reason why it will not explode in 10 years from now has a lot to do with the fact that a completely unexpected event took place, which is that by the 19th century, a process that nobody expected took place, which is what is called the demographic transition. Suddenly, the number of kids per head fell very rapidly, at least in Europe. And we would want to think that this is endogenous to the process itself. And there's a lot of reason, and I will not have the time to dwell on them, that this is not the case, that the demographic transition was in the cards as early as in the 18th century, at the time when the Industrial Revolution itself did not start. For example, the French was very much ahead of the curve of demographic transition, which is why the French today are at par with the German or the English in terms of population, when in the beginning of the 18th century they were as much French as they were German plus English people. So the fact that they started earlier explained why they lost ground, and all the nostalgia that the French have of their grandeur has to do with the fact that they did not catch up in terms of demography. They were ahead of the curve. But this is a way of saying that the demographic transition was a cultural phenomena, at least in the case of France, who was a good 50 or 100 years ahead of the Industrial Revolution. And when you look today at the reason why the demographic transition is taking place all over the place, the argument that this is endogenous to prosperity or income, the kind of Becker trade-off between quality and quantity, doesn't seem to apply. The number of kids per woman is falling all over the place, that the women work or not, that they are in the countryside or in the field. So it is an indication that the economic reasoning is not there. But anyway, the thing of the matter is that a big process was going on without us really noticing that we aborted somehow, if I can say, for something which was completely unpredictable. And I'll come back, of course, to that for the present time. Which takes us to the second phase, the Industrial Revolution, and there it's very simple. This is the beginning of an era, certainly in Europe and in the US and in a few other countries in the 19th century, by which the income per head started to rise indefinitely. Malthus was vanquished, and along with the demographic transition, we've moved from a world in which income was stable and population was rising to just exactly the symmetric world in which population tends to stabilize and income per head is rising. So this seems to mean that we have vanquished the laws pertaining to the agrarian society, and for the better, because we become wealthier and wealthier all the time as long as growth is continuing. Now, it may be that without noticing, the same way I think the agrarian societies were not noticing what was going on to them, without noticing, we are subject to another law. A law which, of course, doesn't have to do with the fact that income per head would be stagnating. It has been rising, and I'll come back to the prospect that we have ahead of us. But another law according to which perhaps the wealth that we are accumulating is not making us happier. Our well-being may be stagnating, same way income per head was stagnating before. Of course, this is known in the academic profession as the Easterlin paradox. The Easterlin paradox has been presented by Easterlin himself in 1974 in a paper in which he presented evidences that the happiness self-reported by individuals, the well-being, the life satisfaction indices were not at all increasing with the level of income, that in fact they were stagnating. There's been a lot of debate in the academic profession about the Easterlin paradox with yes, no's. At the beginning, Easterlin himself was a true outlier. Now there is a full industry working on these well-being indices. I think there's even a journal now. There's been many books. It is contested, and I will not have to dwell maybe in the discussion afterwards as to whether the balance tilts one way or the other, but it is certain that it took us a long time as a profession to accept the fact that it could be at least that yes, well-being was stagnating despite the wealth that we are accumulating. And if that was the case, I think it will be all Malthusian law, something which drives the process of our societies without us understanding, acknowledging that perhaps it is for nothing. We want more and more wealth, but in the end we are not happier. Just the same way the ancient societies were building up very complex societies for a result which was no income per head growth at all. The reason why there is, of course, a lot of interest in the Easterlin paradox is that Easterlin has not only shown that there was some stagnation in the well-being such as he registered it, or such as the later scholars registered it, but there are some laws which appear to be the same all over the places. For instance, one of those which I find the most fascinating and that will be of interest to some people in this room is that the degree of well-being as a function of age is a U-shaped function. That is, you're happy when you're 20, 25, and then it starts falling in all countries in the world at more or less the same speed until you reach, what, Richard? 50, 55, and then it climbs up again. And when you are in your whatever, later on, you get back to the degree of well-being that you had in your 20s. And it's everywhere the same. There's something like a law that shows that it's not just a noise. It's not just people say, well, I'm not happy because I'm not happy. No, there's this variation which are really similar across countries, which I think obliges us to take seriously this law of motion. And of course, there's many anecdotic evidence which has been brought further that people whose well-being is reported to be lower has a higher probability of divorcing, of suiciding perhaps, although I saw that there was a recent paper by Deaton challenging the idea that it was correlated to suicide, but there's many, many indications that this thing is going on. And when you want to dig in why is it the case that we are wealthier but not happier, the two reasons that comes all the time are fairly straightforward to understand. Just the same way the Malthusian law itself was fairly easy to understand. More people and therefore income falls with the demographic explosion. Basically it amounts to two parameters. One is what the psychologists call habituation, and the other one which is comparison. So habituation is simply the fact that the human species, relatively to the other ones, perhaps has an extraordinary ability to adapt to the environment in which it is. Some Darwinian expert would say that in order to adapt to a changing environment, we move from the Sahara to the North Pole, you need to adapt yourself to any environment and to be only sensitive to changes in the environment so that you may fall asleep in the middle of a noise provided that it's regular, and the little quips up awakes you because it's out of the average range of what you are expected to do. So there's an element of adaptation, of habituation, which may be one of the strengths, again, of the human species, which has to do with this extraordinary ability to get used to basically everything, and that's part of the explanation. And in our macro models in particular, in order to feed the macro data as a business cycle, all the DSGE model, which has a sophisticated macro modeling that we use to replicate the business cycle, has this habit consumption parameter into them. That is, you consume, but the benefit that you have is proportionate or is subtracted somehow to how much you consumed before. So it's really the delta, the variation, that makes you happy, not the state of nature, whatever it is. So that's one thing. The other things which also may have to do with some Darwinian process is the fact that we compare each other all the time to what we have, to what the other have. You know, being rich doesn't mean anything. It's telling you you earn 500, 10,000 euro doesn't mean a thing until you know how much the other guys with whom you live earn. So we are all the time comparing ourselves to what the other one are doing. And again, this may be a trait of the human nature to have a sense of empathy, of relating to one another, which is beyond what the other species have, although we do find signs of empathy in some monks or some apes. And so it's not just specifically human, but certainly we develop it beyond what the other species are trying to do. So that explains why when a society at large gets richer, it doesn't bring anything on average to the people, because happiness, according to this comparison element, is a zero-sum game. I'm only happy if I'm wealthier than you, which is part of the, I think, misunderstanding of the controversy surrounding whether the Easterlin paradox is right or not. Easterlin will be the very first to argue that the wealthier people are happier than the poorer people in a given society. What matters is for the society at large. Is it the case that on average you are happier when you are wealthier? If you just look at the US, I think it's a well understood and well accepted fact that the US as a whole has a level of well-being which is below, significantly below, the degree of well-being that it has reached in the 60s, for instance. It's falling down the drain over the past 50 years, although it is much richer. Same thing in France. When you look at the well-being indicator, it's really, really flat over the past 50 years, although we are twice richer in France than we were in the 1970s. So there's a lot of things to be said about this law, but it's very important to understand why it undermines our willingness to get rich in terms of well-being. And to summarize this, you could say that the anthropologists, they are studying kinship. Whom should I marry that is allowed by the rule of the society in which we live? And as a joke, you can say that the Easterlin paradox teaches us what you could call the tragedy, not of the king, the brother, the sister, but perhaps the tragedy of the brother-in-law. That is, you want to be richer than your brother-in-law. There is a famous joke from a 19th century humorist, which is that being rich is earning 1 pound more than your brother-in-law. And there are a lot of statistics showing that women whose sister has married someone wealthier than their own husband have a probability of working which is significantly above the probability of working of their own sister. So you are all the time comparing yourself to the degree of income that the other people have. So that somehow summarizes this long introduction into one thing, which is very simple. All modern societies are eager not of wealth, but of growth. We want growth because that's how we are surprised. That's how we can go beyond what we think, we are, beyond what we think we can reach, given what the other one have achieved, and this is a self-repeated process of deception. Now, the fact that growth is the engine of modern society is a very important fact, and we should perhaps take 5 minutes to compare it to the idea of progress, which was created, certainly reinvented by the Enlightenment in the 18th century. The idea of progress today is very much associated in the functioning of a society to the economic progress, to economic growth, for this reason that I've highlighted. I think it's clear that this is not at all the ideas that the Enlightenment philosopher had in mind. When they speak of progress, the Rousseau, the Diderot, the Voltaire, they had in mind a progress which was a political progress, a moral progress. In fact, the idea of progress has been reinvented in the 18th century prior to the Industrial Revolution. But after the Scientific Revolution, it comes in between. And it's interesting to see how it comes through. And this is where the title of my book comes from. In the 17th century, the Galileo, the Descartes, the Newton, they discovered that the world, the universe, was presumably infinite, with no borders visible. Infinite but void of any divine presence. That the law of Newton were describing a world with no gods. In fact, all the debates between Pascal and Descartes, the two French philosophers, is about what is the role of God in your philosophy. And Descartes, Pascal was saying to Descartes, you need God only once at the beginning of all times, and then things are set in motion without him. And Descartes spent some time explaining, no, I need him all the time, otherwise it would stop. And Pascal said, no, you've shown that the law of movement, precisely, we're preserving the sum of energy without any exterior intervention. So there was a huge philosophical debate, and philosopher and writer that I quote in the book show that there was, at the end of the 17th century, a huge depression in some philosophical quarters, and Pascal was one of them. What do we do of this world and universe deprived of the presence of God, of the promise of resurrection, and so on? And the response of the 18th century Enlightenment was to argue that we could be happy. That's the answer to a world deprived of the presence of God. We can construct a society where we can grow morally, becoming better person. And none of them had the idea that it was material progress that was beyond that. They had the idea that we could improve the functioning of the society. Descartes used to say that that with the scientific revolution tools, man, in a famous sentence, could become like the master of nature. And the philosopher of the Enlightenment responded that they could simply become the master of the societies in which they live, and this is the bulk of all this reasoning behind Rousseau and Montesquieu and what have you. Now, in practice, it has worked somehow along those lines. We have evolved toward democratic system and so on, but the core of the happiness of our societies is, in this Easterlin paradoxical way, very much contingent on the promise that we have to get wealthier and wealthier all the time. So we need an idea, and that's now where I'm moving to. We need an idea of the future of growth in order to see the extent to which our societies are fooling themselves in the way they organize themselves, or whether they can re-engineer, regenerate this promise. So let me go then to this question. The future of growth. Is growth ending, or is it still there forever after? So, and what should we think of it? As you will see, I will speak of growth itself as it is measured as a percentage of increase of wealth from one period to the other. But I think perhaps the most important thing is the nature of growth, which I think more fundamentally is changing in the world in which we enter. So the future of growth. There's really, as Richard alluded to, there are really in the profession two schools, perhaps not equally balanced. We'll wait together how many people think A or B, but there are really two schools. Those who believe that growth is as endogenous to the process of wealth as population was endogenous to the Malthusian law. That is, more people, more growth, and more wealth, more growth. For basically the same reason. There is a self-catalytic process which is at work, and growth cannot stop because we have all the means to increase it. And I would call these people the believers, because it's really almost a religious war between the believers and the heretics. So the believers say growth is there, just a matter of waiting perhaps a little bit, and we'll see it blossoming. And you have the heretics, the guy who said, no, God is dead and growth is about to die for many reasons, and I'll spell them out in a second. So among the believer, there is one guy who's not an economist, but which is very often quoted as an example of what this autocatalytic process of ever-expanding growth is all about, whose name is Ray Kurzweil, who's a guy who wrote a book called The Singularity is Near. It's very famous because he's a leader of what is called the transhumanist school in the US. I'll come back to what it is. And the starting point, which I find very much in line with what I said about the Malthusian law of Kurzweil, is that things for the human species come all the time more rapidly, all the breakthrough come all the time more rapidly than before. So just to give round numbers of the kind of what Kurzweil is alluding to, the predecessor to the human species appeared, and again, you may multiply by 2 all the numbers that I say, or divide them by 2, but let's say something like 10 million years ago, where the first perhaps bifurcation from the big apes. Then 1 million years ago, again, it's more 1.5 million or 2 million years ago, Homo erectus stood up. Then 100,000 years ago was a modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. Then 10,000 years ago was agriculture. Then 1,000 years ago was a printing press. Then 100 years, it's 200 years ago, came the Industrial Revolution. Then 10 years ago came the internet. So all the major breakthrough, and the point of the book is to demonstrate that these are the breakthrough. It's not cooked up so as to make it look nice. He said that he took the Encyclopedia Britannica and sort of pondered what came as breakthrough, and he found exactly this episode. So they came 10 times more rapidly in the second time than the first, and so on and so on. So we are in an exploding process, maybe of the kind that I described with the Malthusian, singularity. And that's what he called the singularity, that it is exploding, and yes, there will be a point where the thing will blow out. And to put very simply the sort of idea that he has in mind for the current period, and this is very near and very often quoted by the author of a book called The Second Machine Age by Bryanson and McAfee, which is a book which is about explaining all the prospect of growth that we are entering into. The basic idea of Kurzweil, which is also the idea of Bryanson and McAfee, is the fact that with Moore's law, the power of the microchips is doubling every 18 months. So at this speed, says Kurzweil, in the next 30 years, you will have in a flash disk all the information contained in a human brain. You can download all the information of a human brain into the flash disk and perhaps improve the way you do things through this flash disk. And by the end of the 21st century, it is all the brains of the entire human population that will be downloaded in this flash disk. And he says this is a singularity, that the intelligence of the world, of the human species will saturate the universe, will become, And this is, of course, very challenging. And he explained that by the end of the 21st century, we'll reach the point where immortality will become a possibility. As sort of psychological, philosophical parenthesis, it's not obvious that the fact that all the information which is contained in your brain is downloaded in a flash disk is equivalent to become immortal. So I think of the following, I had to think about this following example to understand what's going on. Assume that you write in a book all the things that you know, assuming that this is possible. Someone else reads the book, so it's good for him, but that doesn't make you immortal. You don't become immortal. So it's a different thing. But he has in mind true immortality. He says the cells will be regenerated. We'll learn the science of regenerating the cells. We'll have more and more instruments to fix and change the dysfunctioning arms or whatever part of our bodies, and is only sad that he predicts immortality to become a possibility in the second half of the 21st century, and he says, I won't be there, so I'll miss the thing for just a few decades, but that's the idea. And a metaphor that Kurzweil uses, and that is taken on board by McAfee and Bryanson and McAfee, is the following story. It's about the inventor of the chess game. And as you know this story for sure, the emperor asked to this guy, what do you want? as a reward for this great game. And he says, I want 1 grain of rice on the first, how do you call that, la case square, and then 2 on the second square, and then you multiply it by 2 all over the game, all over the place, and I'll be happy. Of course, we know that it amounts to 2 to the power of 64, minus 1 when you add them all, and that's more than the number of atoms in the universe, apparently. And that's what the Moore's law is all about. By doubling the squares, you go to infinity. And the point that is brought by Brilliantson and McAfee is the following, is that when only the first half of the chessboard has been filled, the emperor does not yet understand what's going on, because on the first half, 2 to the power of 32 minus 1, you just have filled the equivalent of a big field of rice. It's truly in the second half of the chessboard that things really, become hard and tough. And what Brilliantson and McAfee are saying is we are just entering the second half of the chessboard. So that's vision number 1. And then all the digital technologies of the world, of course, can be put as example of this vision that Moore's law has hardly started to change our lives. So, against this vision, what do the pessimistic say? What do the heretics who claim that the end of growth is nearing? So, of course, the leader of the pessimistic school is Robert Gordon, a dear friend who organized for a long time a macro seminar that we all attended at some point. And Gordon rules away all this prediction. And how does he do it? How does he argue against the Moore's law? So there are many points which I think deserve to be heard and digest before I will present with a few minutes that will be left my own synthesis. But basically what Gordon is saying is that over the course of the digital revolution, the last 30 years, let's say, growth has been falling regularly. If you take Europe, if you take France, if you take an average of France, Germany, and Italy, growth kept falling. From 3 to 2 to 1.5, 1, and now we are more or less about an average of 0.5. Of course, financial crisis blurs it all, but certainly it's been falling. Take Japan, was a leader in its own domain in the 80s. The average growth is 0.8% over the past 30 years. So it's not been booming at all. So the only example that you want to address is the US. Yeah, the US has a relatively sustained growth rate, but as we all know, in the work of our friend and colleague Piketty, and in particular the work that Saez has done out of this data, in the US, 90% of the population experienced zero growth of the income per head. All the growth has gone to the top 10%. And within the top 10%, the 1% captures 60% of growth over the past 20 years, 25 years. So if you look at the median worker in the US, in cash terms, it's zero. If you add to the income the contribution for health, which is delayed payment, which is part, let's say, of purchasing power, the average income growth of the median household in the US is 0.4%. That is half the level of the Japanese. So it's not that we are in a revolution that appears to be lifting up growth. And what Gordon says is, I'm very happy to discuss of immortality by the end of the 21st century, but first explain me why this digital revolution, which again has been there for some time, internet has been used in a regular basis for over 20 years. Why is it that it generates a falling growth rate? That's, I think, the big challenge. Usually the answer is it takes time. But the answer to it takes time before it creates the seeds of a growing growth rate is that, yes, it takes time because it takes time before the equipment rates in the new technology climbs up. It took the 50s, before the equipment rate in cars and even telephones started to become significant. Here we are already at an equipment rate for the smartphone of about 100%. The access to internet in the rich countries is already averaging, I don't know what's the number, 75 or 80%. So it's not the equipment rate is lagging behind the innovation. So we have a puzzle. So how is Gordon addressing this puzzle? So for those who know Gordon, we know he's a very pessimistic, rushy kind of guy, and he makes, I think, a very interesting point, which is what is it that this digital revolution bringing in terms of the consumer goods? Forget production, I'll come back to it. But as a consumer, what's new? And the answer is the smartphone, for sure. It's new. It was not there, and we all have one in our pockets. But beyond that, it's the same stuff. Still cars, still planes going at about the same speed, and it doesn't compare to the big change that was brought by the previous industrial revolution, when you move from darkness to light with electricity, with the air conditioning, with the cars, with the airways, where you had a huge transformation of the conditions of life for the advanced economy. And this huge transformation that was brought by the previous industrial revolution generated, on average, averaging the ups and downs of growth over the 20th century, average 2% per head. So how do you think that the smartphone alone could generate more than half this number if basically we already have one, and that all the rest remain more or less the change? So the pessimistic view of Gordon is it's overblown. We all have the smartphone. We're very happy to chat with our friend instead of watching television, perhaps, yes. So it's more interesting, perhaps, but it's not a game changer the way television itself was, or movies and whatever it is. Let me try to start from Gordon to attempt at making a synthesis, because we have with the other view, because here we really have two opposite and conflicting views. And we better know, because it depends very much on whether some optimism will be restored in our society with the prospect of growth, or whether we have to live with this end of growth, end of God, of modern gods, God kind of world. I think the solution comes in part from looking at the producer side. When it comes to production, there's no question that internet has dramatically changed the way the old industrial society has been functioning. We offshore, many more things. The organization of trade itself is completely different from the way it was. And let's try to understand what is behind this process on the supply side. And I'll come back to the consumer side with, again, the 5 minutes that I've left with. Think of what happened over the 20th century. In fact, and this is a point that Gordon emphasized, the 20th century, with the electricity, cars, and so on, is not just one revolution. It's at least two revolutions for the price of one. One is a revolution in industry. We invented a wide range of new goods and we learned how to produce them. But prior to that, somehow, in the same time as this revolution, we had another one, which was an agricultural revolution. It's truly over the course of the 20th century that agriculture became very productive. This is where fertilizer, tractors got to be invented, and the number of peasants in society, in France, in Italy, I'm sure, and certainly in the US as well, has shrunk for about 50% at the beginning of the 20th century to essentially zero today. So we had half the population whose productivity has been infinite. And this half, these peasants, went to the country, left the countryside to go to the cities where the industry offered very productive job rising with the technologies of the 20th century. When we think about what's going on today, we don't have the agricultural revolution. We are about a process in which a subgroup of workers are displaced by the new technologies, and the question is, where do they go? The peasants went to the cities when they became workers, blue-collar workers, and they become productive. And I think this is the essence of the question. Where do they go and what do they become? This becomes a better known topic because the specialists of labor have looked at the evolutions that has been created by the digital revolution, and they reach, hope I'm making it right to the expert in the room, they reach a conclusion that the new industries, the new technologies created a polarization of society. That is, the jobs that were more productive after the Industrial Revolution was indeed at the very top. Now, any trader from its smartphone can, manipulate billions, no problem. If you are at the top of the hierarchy, you can send message by pressing a button to all your employees. I think it's Joe Stiglitz. I remember Joe saying this thing, which struck me as very, very clever. He said, the email technology is very productive for sending message, but not productive for reading them. So the guy who can send a message, yes, becomes very productive, but all of us who read them, we have to take the time to read them and to digest information that is contained. So yes, there is obviously a very strong complementarity between this new technology and the kind of job which are done at the very top of society. In between, the polarization is about the fact that more and more softwares do the job that used to be done by the middle class. So here, it's not a question of complementarity, it's really a question of substitutability. The software does the job that was done by the guy in a bank or an insurance company, which was basically asking you how much money you want, yes, let me see, fill the thing. We know that the software can do that very rapidly. When you enter into a bank and ask for a credit, the time you spend compared to the amount of information that they already have on you is just absurd, and you see here that there is a process going on that will still marching on. So where are the other jobs, performing? Well, at the low end, this is what the U curve, the polarization, is all about. In the low end, there's many jobs that the computers for now cannot do. Those who require a face-to-face. Those where you need, a nurse to take the hand of the guy until, of course, the software or the watch will do it for you. But there's a wide range of unskilled jobs which survive. But unskilled jobs means what? Means they survive not because they are becoming more productive with the computers. They survive because the computers do not go there. I think if you put that together, you understand why growth is disappointing. There's a lot of substitution in between, a lot of complementarity, but only at the very top, and it's neutral in the end. So let me give you a numerical example to see what it means, this idea that technological progress has more substitutability to workers and complementarity for the society at large. So think of an economy in which you have two halves, each of them have 100 people. So sector A has 100 people, sector B has 100 people. This is more or less like my peasant versus industry worker at the beginning of the 20th century. And assume that the software, the computers, just substitute entirely for the jobs which are performed in the first half of the economy, sector A. So you had 100 people in sector A, they are entirely slashed by software. The people working in this first half, they migrate to the second half, which therefore double in size. So assuming that there was nobody lost in the process, that is, they do succeed in reaching the second half where they can still have a job. Question to the economist in the room: what is the growth rate of such an economy if I assume that it takes 50 years for this thing to happen. That is, if we assume that in 1980 it started, it will end in 2030, half the population, which is the order of magnitude that circulates about the extent to which the software will replace the people working in the economy, half of them will move to the other hand. What is the growth rate of such an economy? Well, a priori, you think it's going to be big because half the population experience a growth rate of its productivity of plus infinity. There was 100 people, there are 0, and the same good is produced. All right? So here's a number. You start with a GDP, which is originally assuming that each worker produced 1 unit of GDP at the beginning of my process. You start with an economy where GDP is 200, 100 plus 100. In the end of my process, 50 years later, the people in sector B has doubled, so the GDP that they produce has moved from 100 to 200. And what sector A was producing is there. Let's say for free, but I count it in GDP. So we've moved from a GDP of 100 plus 100, 200, to a GDP which is 100 plus 200, 300. So that makes 300 as opposed to 200. The average growth rate, yearly speaking, is 0.8, which is a Japanese growth rate, incidentally. So 0.8, less than 1%, less than one half of what we had in the 20th century. Of course, this is assuming that the good which is produced by the software is for free. Let me assume that the guy who are behind the software in sector A keeps half of the rent. So he captures Bill Gates of the world. He captures 50 out of the 100 which is produced by the software in sector A. Okay, you follow me? Yeah? Therefore, for the rest of the world, for the rest of the economy, the growth rate is reduced by half because half of the gain is captured by this Bill Gates guy. So you have an economy in which the growth rate is not 0.8 but it's 0.4, and a world in which the Bill Gates of the world capture 50 out of 300, that is 15% more of the GDP than before. I've just described exactly the US economy. An average growth rate for the median worker of 0.4% with an increase in the share going to the 1%, which is exactly about 15%. So that is, I think, what this polarization is all about. The fact that growth is disappointing, it's captured by the top 1%, and the reason why it's disappointing is because in my example, the people in sector B experience no increase in their productivity. All the productivity is concentrated in the group that is substituted for. So let me, I think I've extended my time, so let me close here and I'll answer to more questions afterwards. To say that on an optimistic note, I think this conflict between Gordon and the optimistic arises and is very much linked to this polarization of society. The fact that society is polarized has obviously huge consequences, and it goes well beyond the growth rate in itself. If, I'm speaking to the political scientists now, if the economy polarizes society, it's not a surprise that the politics also are polarized. The fact that the middle class feels threatened, is eroded by these new technologies, is of huge political consequences and makes it more difficult for democracies to work. We know since Aristotle at least that the middle class is needed for democracy to function, and I think that the period, very difficult period in which we enter, has a lot to do with the fact that we don't know what to offer to the middle class. For the economist also, this is very difficult to build upon. We used to think, 20 years ago, that the solution to technological progress, which we interpreted as skill biased, the solution to the new technological progress was to educate people, get them more to school and they will be more productive. If there is a hole in between, this promise becomes more complicated to validate because no, it's only on the very top that there is a promise of complementarity. So there's a lot to be digged into. I will stop and discuss with you further on all these issues. But beyond this sheer question of growth, beyond the sheer question of how do we redistribute the prospect, the increase of growth that we have, I think that deep down we have a deep question which has to do with the nature of work, the nature of the way technologies operate in our society, the fear that it creates for the middle class, and this is, of course, well beyond what the economists can deal with. Okay, thank you.